Question 1. Regulatory review indicates that a long-standing client of Seino Holdings has requested a specific type of transaction that, while common in other markets, appears to fall into a gray area concerning current Seino Holdings' internal compliance policies and potentially the spirit of relevant financial regulations. The client is pressing for immediate execution due to a perceived time-sensitive opportunity. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Seino Holdings employee handling this request? Option A. Execute the transaction as requested by the client, assuming it is permissible unless explicitly prohibited by a clear regulation, and inform the compliance department after execution. Option B. Decline the transaction outright without further investigation, citing general compliance concerns to the client. Option C. Proceed with the transaction, but implement additional internal monitoring measures to mitigate potential risks, without seeking explicit clarification from compliance beforehand. Option D. Immediately halt the transaction process. Consult with Seino Holdings Compliance Department and legal counsel to thoroughly assess the request against all applicable regulations and internal policies, and then communicate the findings and any compliant alternatives to the client. Correct answer is A. Execute the transaction as requested by the client, assuming it is permissible unless explicitly prohibited by a clear regulation, and inform the compliance department after execution. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Seino Holdings employees due to the inherent conflict between client relationship management and regulatory compliance. The need to maintain strong client relationships is crucial for business success, but it must never supersede the obligation to adhere to regulatory frameworks. The challenge lies in navigating situations where a client's request, while seemingly beneficial or routine from a business perspective, might inadvertently breach or skirt regulatory boundaries. Employees must exercise sound judgment, possess a thorough understanding of applicable regulation, and be prepared to communicate difficult but necessary decisions to clients in a professional and transparent manner. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to the Seino Holdings' internal compliance policies and relevant regulatory guidelines over the client's immediate request. This is the right professional practice because regulatory frameworks are designed to ensure market integrity, protect investors, and maintain fairness. By strictly following these rules, Seino Holdings upholds its legal and ethical obligations, mitigating risks of penalties, reputational damage, and client harm. Specifically, if a client's request is found to be non-compliant, the appropriate action is to clearly explain the regulatory prohibition to the client, offer alternative compliance solutions if available, and document the interaction and decision-making process. This demonstrates professionalism, transparency, and a commitment to responsible business conduct. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that prioritizes the client's request without thorough regulatory scrutiny is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the established legal and ethical standards governing financial services. Such an approach risks significant regulatory breaches, leading to fines, sanctions, and severe reputational damage for Seino Holdings. Furthermore, it could expose clients to undue risks and potentially lead to unfair market practices. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the client's request while assuming it is compliant without verifying it against current regulations. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold the professional responsibility to understand and apply regulatory requirements. It is a passive form of noncompliance that can have the same severe consequences as intentional breaches. Finally, an approach that attempts to find loopholes or interpret regulations in a way that favors the client's request, even if technically arguable, is also professionally unsound. This can be seen as an attempt to circumvent the spirit of the law, which can lead to regulatory scrutiny and potential penalties. Professional conduct demands a strict and unambiguous interpretation of regulations in favor of compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Seino Holdings should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the client's request. This request must then be rigorously assessed against all applicable internal policies and external regulatory frameworks. If any doubt or potential conflict arises, the employee should immediately consult with the compliance department or legal counsel. The decision should always err on the side of caution and strict regulatory adherence. Communication with the client should be clear, respectful, and focused on explaining the regulatory constraints and offering compliant alternatives. Documentation of the entire process, including the request, the review, the decision, and the communication, is paramount for accountability and future reference. Question 2. Consider a scenario where a long-standing client of Seino Holdings, who is also a significant shareholder in a publicly listed company, approaches their relationship manager with a request to execute a large block trade of that company's shares immediately after receiving non-public material information about an upcoming merger. The client explicitly states they want to get ahead of the market before the news is officially announced. Option A. Decline the trade request immediately and inform the client that Seino Holdings cannot facilitate such a transaction due to potential regulatory violations. Option B. Decline the trade request and engage in a discussion with the client to understand their objectives, explain the regulatory concerns regarding trading on material non-public information, and propose alternative compliant investment strategies. Option C. Proceed with executing the trade as requested by the client, as the client is a valued customer and has provided clear instructions. Option D. Execute the trade but ensure that all internal documentation is meticulously updated to reflect the client's instructions and the rationale for proceeding. The correct answer is C. Proceed with executing the trade as requested by the client, as the client is a valued customer and has provided clear instructions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific outcome and the regulatory obligations of an advisor. Seino Holdings, as a financial services firm, operates under strict regulatory frameworks designed to protect investors and ensure market integrity. The challenge lies in navigating the client's instructions while adhering to these regulations, which often prioritize transparency, suitability, and the prevention of market abuse. Careful judgment is required to balance client relationships with legal and ethical responsibilities. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the client's objectives and a diligent assessment of whether those objectives can be met within the bounds of applicable regulations. This includes verifying the legitimacy of the client's request, ensuring it does not involve insider trading, market manipulation, or other prohibited activities, and confirming that any proposed transaction is suitable for the client's profile. The regulatory justification stems from principles of investor protection, market fairness, and the duty of care owed by financial institutions. Specifically, regulations would mandate that Seino Holdings acts in the best interests of its client and complies with all anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing laws, as well as rules against market abuse. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the client's request without adequate due diligence fails to uphold the regulatory duty of care. This could lead to facilitating illegal activities, such as insider trading or market manipulation, which carry severe penalties for both the client and Seino Holdings. Another incorrect approach, that of outright refusal without explanation or offering alternative compliance solutions, could damage the client relationship and potentially lead to reputational damage for Seino Holdings, though it might be a necessary step if the request is fundamentally illegal. A third incorrect approach, that of attempting to find loopholes in regulations to satisfy the client's request, is ethically unsound and likely to violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the law, exposing Seino Holdings to significant regulatory risk. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the client's request. This should be followed by a comprehensive review of all relevant regulatory requirements and internal policies. If the request appears to be non-compliant or raises red flags, the professional must escalate the matter internally for further review and seek clarification from compliance departments. The ultimate decision must prioritize regulatory adherence and ethical conduct, even if it means declining the client's request or proposing alternative compliance strategies. Question 3. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a particular candidate, who is a known associate of a senior executive, may possess unique insights relevant to a specific role at Seino Holdings that are not fully captured by the standard assessment questions. How should the hiring manager proceed to ensure fairness and compliance with the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test guidelines? Option A. Hiring manager should subtly adjust the scoring rubric for this specific candidate to reflect the perceived unique insights mentioned by the stakeholder. Option B. The hiring manager should proceed with the assessment as designed, ensuring all candidates are evaluated solely on their performance against the established criteria within the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test, and document the feedback for future process review if appropriate. Option C. The hiring manager should disregard the stakeholders' feedback entirely, as it is not part of the formal assessment process outlined in the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test. Option D. The hiring manager should conduct a separate, informal interview with the candidate to probe these unique insights, and then incorporate the subjective assessment from this interview into the overall evaluation. The correct answer is B. The hiring manager should proceed with the assessment as designed, ensuring all candidates are evaluated solely on their performance against the established criteria within the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test, and document the feedback for future process review if appropriate. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, as a financial services firm, must navigate the complex interplay between client needs, regulatory obligations, and internal policies. The core difficulty lies in balancing the desire to retain a valuable client by accommodating their request with the absolute imperative to adhere strictly to the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. Misinterpreting or circumventing these requirements, even with good intentions, can lead to significant compliance breaches, reputational damage, and potential disciplinary action. Careful judgment is required to identify the legally permissible and ethically sound course of action. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test's specific guidelines regarding candidate assessment and the handling of external information. This approach prioritizes adherence to the established testing protocols, ensuring that all candidates are evaluated on a consistent and objective basis as mandated by the assessment framework. The regulatory justification for this is rooted in principles of fairness, transparency, and the integrity of the hiring process. The assessment is designed to measure specific competencies and suitability for roles within Seino Holdings, and introducing external, potentially biased, information or altering the assessment process for one candidate undermines this objective and violates the spirit and letter of the regulatory framework governing hiring assessments. An incorrect approach that involves directly incorporating the stakeholders' feedback into the assessment scoring without a clear, predefined process within the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test framework is professionally unacceptable. This fails to uphold the principle of equal opportunity for all candidates and introduces subjectivity that is contrary to standardized assessment practices. The regulatory failure here is a breach of fairness and potentially discrimination, as it creates an uneven playing field. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the stakeholders' feedback entirely without any internal review or consideration of its relevance within the established assessment parameters, is also professionally unsound. While adherence to the assessment framework is paramount, a complete disregard for stakeholder input can lead to missed opportunities for process improvement or understanding potential systemic issues. The ethical failure here lies in a lack of due diligence and potentially alienating key stakeholders, even if the ultimate decision is to maintain the integrity of the assessment. A third incorrect approach, such as seeking to subtly influence the assessment outcome to align with the stakeholder's request without explicit justification or documentation, is a serious ethical and regulatory violation. This constitutes an attempt to manipulate the assessment process, undermining its credibility and potentially leading to the hiring of unsuitable candidates. The regulatory and ethical failures are severe, involving dishonesty, lack of transparency, and a breach of trust. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the core objective. What is the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test designed to achieve? 2. Identify relevant regulations and policies. What specific rules govern candidate assessment and feedback handling? 3. Assess the nature of the feedback. Is it objective, subjective, or potentially biased? 4. Determine permissible actions. What steps can be taken within the established framework to address the feedback? 5. Document all decisions and actions. Maintain a clear record of the process and rationale. 6. Seek clarification if necessary. If the framework is ambiguous, consult with the relevant internal compliance or HR departments. Question 4. The investigation demonstrates that a senior manager at Seino Holdings may have engaged in misconduct that could impact client relationships. The internal audit team has gathered preliminary evidence, but the full scope and implications are still unclear. What is the most appropriate next step for the Seino Holdings Compliance Department to ensure a fair and compliant process? Option A. Establish a formal, confidential investigation team. Define its scope and ensure it operates independently, adhering strictly to Seino Holdings' internal policies and relevant regulations regarding employee investigations and data privacy. Option B. Share the preliminary evidence with the implicated senior managers, direct reports to gauge their reactions, and gather informal feedback on the manager's performance. Option C. Immediately inform all department heads at Seino Holdings about the potential misconduct to ensure transparency and allow them to take precautionary measures. Option D. Suspend the implicated senior manager immediately and conduct a thorough review of all their past client interactions without further investigation. The correct answer is C. Immediately inform all department heads at Seino Holdings about the potential misconduct to ensure transparency and allow them to take precautionary measures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Seino Holdings due to the potential for conflicts of interest and the need to maintain client confidentiality, especially when dealing with sensitive information obtained during an internal investigation. Core difficulty lies in balancing the company's obligation to investigate potential misconduct with its duty to protect the privacy and interests of its employees and clients. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the investigation is conducted fairly, impartially, and in accordance with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. The correct approach involves a structured and documented process that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This includes clearly defining the scope of the investigation, ensuring that all information gathered is relevant and necessary, and maintaining strict confidentiality. The investigation team should be independent and free from conflicts of interest. Any findings must be reported objectively and handled in a manner that respects due process and avoids prejudgment. This approach is justified by the need to uphold the integrity of Seino Holdings, comply with employment laws and data protection regulations, and maintain trust with employees and stakeholders. An incorrect approach would be to broadly share information about the investigation with unrelated departments or individuals within Seino Holdings without a legitimate need to know. This failure breaches confidentiality obligations, potentially violates data privacy laws, and could create an environment of suspicion and distrust, negatively impacting employee morale and the company's reputation. Another incorrect approach would be to make assumptions or draw conclusions about the individuals involved before the investigation is complete. This demonstrates a lack of impartiality and due process, which is ethically unsound and could lead to unfair disciplinary actions, exposing Seino Holdings to legal challenges. Furthermore, failing to document the investigation process meticulously, including evidence collection and decision-making, would be a significant regulatory and ethical lapse, hindering accountability and transparency. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core ethical and regulatory principles at play. This involves understanding the specific laws and internal policies governing investigations, confidentiality, and data protection relevant to Seino Holdings. Next, they should assess the potential risks and consequences of various actions, considering impacts on individuals, the company, and its reputation. The framework should then guide the selection of the approach that best upholds these principles, minimizes risks, and ensures fairness and due process throughout the investigation. Regular consultation with legal and compliance departments is crucial to navigate complex situations and ensure adherence to all requirements. Question 5. The analysis reveals that a candidate for a position at Seino Holdings is tasked with developing a proposal for a new internal compliance training module. The candidate has extensive experience with compliance training in a different, albeit related, financial sector in another country. The candidate believes their prior experience offers superior methodologies that could significantly enhance the training. However, the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test explicitly states that all responses must adhere only to the regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines specified for this exam, and that no external or foreign regulations should be referenced or applied. Which approach best demonstrates the candidate's understanding of the assessment's jurisdictional requirements? Option A. Develop the training module proposal by integrating the candidate's prior international experience and best practices, assuming they are generally applicable and beneficial. Option B. Design the training module proposal by exclusively referencing and applying the principles, regulations, and guidelines stipulated within the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test specified jurisdiction, seeking to adapt existing knowledge to these specific parameters. Option C. Propose a hybrid approach, incorporating elements from both the candidate's prior international experience and the specified assessment jurisdiction, with a disclaimer that the international elements are suggestions for potential improvement. Option D. Focus the proposal on general ethical principles of compliance training, avoiding specific regulatory references from either jurisdiction to maintain broad applicability. The correct answer is A. Develop the training module proposal by integrating the candidate's prior international experience and best practices, assuming they are generally applicable and beneficial. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, as a financial institution, operates under strict regulatory oversight. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient internal operations with the absolute requirement of adhering to the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests specified regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines. Misinterpreting or deviating from these mandates, even with good intentions, can lead to serious compliance breaches, reputational damage, and potential penalties. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions taken during the hiring process are not only effective, but also demonstrably compliant with the precise dictates of the assessment's jurisdiction. The correct approach involves a meticulous and exclusive adherence to the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests, regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines. This means that any information, precedent, or best practice referenced or applied must originate solely from the specified jurisdiction and be directly relevant to the assessment's context. This approach is correct because it directly fulfills the primary directive of the assessment, which is to test the candidate's ability to operate strictly within the defined parameters. It demonstrates an understanding of the critical importance of jurisdictional compliance in regulated industries, preventing the introduction of foreign or irrelevant standards that could compromise the integrity of the hiring process and the company's adherence to its own governing rules. An incorrect approach that relies on general industry best practices without verifying their alignment with the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test's specific jurisdiction is professionally unacceptable. This fails because it introduces external standards that may not be legally or ethically permissible within the assessment's defined framework. It suggests a lack of diligence in understanding and applying the precise requirements, potentially leading to actions that, while common elsewhere, could be non-compliant in this specific context. Another incorrect approach that incorporates regulations or guidelines from other jurisdictions, even if seemingly similar or more advanced, is also professionally unacceptable. This directly violates the strict jurisdictional compliance mandate. It demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the assessment's purpose, which is to evaluate the candidate's ability to navigate and operate within a specific set of rules. Such an approach risks introducing legal conflicts, operational inconsistencies, and a failure to meet the exact standards expected by Seino Holdings for this assessment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough and immediate identification of the governing regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines for the specific task or assessment. This involves actively seeking out and understanding the precise scope and limitations of the applicable jurisdiction. Any proposed action, strategy, or reference point must then be rigorously cross-referenced against these defined parameters. If there is any doubt about the applicability or permissibility of an external piece of information or practice, it should be excluded. The priority is always to operate within the explicitly stated boundaries, demonstrating a commitment to compliance and a clear understanding of the operational environment. Question 6. Stakeholder feedback indicates a concern that the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test evaluation criteria are not sufficiently transparent to candidates, potentially impacting their understanding of the assessment outcomes. Considering the regulatory framework governing the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test, which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for Seino Holdings? Option A. Ignore the feedback, assuming candidates are not privy to the internal workings of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test and that the current process is sufficient. Option B. Immediately release the detailed scoring rubrics and specific interview question methodologies to all candidates who have taken the assessment to address the transparency concerns directly. Option C. Share anonymized aggregate performance data with stakeholders to demonstrate the general fairness of the assessment, without addressing the specific concerns about individual candidate feedback. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test guidelines to identify permissible methods for providing clearer, yet compliant, feedback to candidates regarding assessment outcomes and evaluation principles, without revealing proprietary assessment details. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test guidelines to identify permissible methods for providing clearer, yet compliant, feedback to candidates regarding assessment outcomes and evaluation principles, without revealing proprietary assessment details. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, as a regulated entity, must navigate conflicting stakeholder interests while adhering strictly to its legal and ethical obligations. The core difficulty lies in balancing the desire for immediate financial gain with the long-term implications of regulatory compliance and maintaining stakeholder trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any proposed action by Seino Holdings is not only commercially viable, but also fully compliant with the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests specific guidelines regarding the handling of candidate data and the disclosure of assessment methodologies. This approach prioritizes transparency and adherence to the established rules, ensuring that Seino Holdings acts ethically and legally. Specifically, it requires understanding the precise stipulations within the assessment framework that govern what information can be shared with candidates or external parties, and under what conditions. This upholds the integrity of the hiring process and protects proprietary assessment tools, while also respecting the rights of candidates to understand the basis of their evaluation within the defined parameters of the test. An incorrect approach that involves disclosing the proprietary scoring algorithms or specific interview question banks to candidates or external parties would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate the confidentiality clauses likely embedded within the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests framework, potentially compromising the validity and fairness of future assessments. It could also lead to accusations of bias or unfair advantage if such information were to be misused. Furthermore, sharing this sensitive information could expose Seino Holdings to legal repercussions for breaching intellectual property rights or contractual obligations related to the assessment tools. Another incorrect approach, such as dismissing the stakeholder feedback entirely without proper investigation, would be a failure in professional duty of care and stakeholder engagement. While the feedback might be misinformed, a regulated entity like Seino Holdings has an obligation to acknowledge and investigate such concerns to ensure its processes are robust and perceived as fair. Ignoring feedback, even if it appears to challenge the assessment's integrity, can erode trust and lead to reputational damage, and may also mask genuine issues that need addressing within the framework's guidelines. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory framework in this case, the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test specific rules and guidelines. Upon receiving stakeholder feedback, the first step is to acknowledge it and initiate an internal review process. This review should involve consulting the relevant sections of the assessment framework to determine the permissible actions regarding the feedback. If the feedback points to potential breaches or areas for improvement within the framework scope, appropriate corrective actions should be identified and implemented. If the feedback is based on a misunderstanding of the framework, a clear and compliant communication strategy should be developed to address the concerns without compromising the integrity of the assessment process or violating any regulations. Question 7. To address the challenge of ensuring that all hiring practices at Seino Holdings strictly adhere to the specified regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines for the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test, which of the following approaches is most professionally sound? Option A. Developing and applying hiring protocols that are exclusively derived from and demonstrably compliant with the precise regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines outlined for the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test. Option B. Relying on the discretion of experienced hiring managers to interpret and apply the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test regulations based on their professional judgment, allowing for flexibility where they deem it appropriate. Option C. Implementing hiring procedures that are informed by a combination of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests requirements and general best practices observed in other financial institutions globally. Option D. Prioritizing the speed and efficiency of the hiring process, while ensuring that the core principles of fairness are maintained, even if it means slightly deviating from some of the more detailed procedural requirements of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test. The correct answer is C. Implementing hiring procedures that are informed by a combination of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test requirements and general best practices observed in other financial institutions globally. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, as a financial institution, operates under strict regulatory oversight. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient internal operations and client service with the absolute imperative of adhering to the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test specific regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines. Misinterpreting or deviating from these prescribed rules, even with good intentions, can lead to significant compliance breaches, reputational damage, and potential penalties. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions taken are demonstrably within the defined jurisdictional boundaries of the assessment. The correct approach involves a meticulous and exclusive adherence to the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests, regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines. This means that any decision-making process, particularly concerning hiring practices or operational procedures that might intersect with regulatory requirements, must be grounded solely in the specified rules. This approach is correct because it directly fulfills the primary objective of the assessment: to evaluate a candidate's ability to operate strictly within the defined legal and regulatory confines of Seino Holdings. It demonstrates an understanding of the paramount importance of compliance and the potential consequences of operating outside of it. This aligns with the ethical duty of professionals in regulated industries to uphold the law and internal policies without exception. An incorrect approach would be to introduce external regulatory frameworks or general industry best practices not explicitly mentioned in the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test. This is a regulatory failure because it demonstrates a lack of understanding of the specific jurisdiction being tested. The assessment is designed to gauge proficiency within a defined set of rules, and referencing other regulations, even if they seem similar or more comprehensive, indicates an inability to focus on and apply the prescribed framework. This can lead to confusion, misapplication of rules, and ultimately, non-compliance with Seino Holdings specific requirements. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize perceived operational efficiency or client convenience over strict adherence to the assessment's regulatory framework. While efficiency is important, in a regulated environment, compliance is absolute. Making decisions based on what seems faster or easier, without first confirming it aligns with the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test rules, is an ethical and regulatory failure. It suggests a willingness to cut corners or overlook established procedures, which can have serious repercussions for the firm and its clients. This approach fails to recognize that regulatory compliance is not optional but a foundational requirement for professional conduct. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a clear identification of the applicable regulatory framework, in this case, the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test's specified rules. All subsequent actions and decisions must be filtered through this framework. If there is any ambiguity, the professional should seek clarification from authorized sources within the context of the assessment's guidelines. The guiding principle should always be strict adherence to the defined jurisdiction, prioritizing compliance above all other considerations. Question 8. The review process indicates that a potential new client, a significant corporation, has a minor, previously undisclosed administrative compliance issue that, while not currently impacting their core operations, could be flagged during a routine audit. Seino Holdings is eager to onboard this client due to the substantial revenue they represent. You are tasked with deciding how to proceed with the client onboarding process. Option A. Proceed with onboarding the client and discreetly initiate internal efforts to rectify the compliance issue without informing the client, to avoid potentially jeopardizing the deal. Option B. Inform the client about the minor compliance issue and suggest they resolve it independently without further involvement from Seino Holdings, proceeding with onboarding once they confirm resolution. Option C. Proceed with onboarding the client immediately, as the compliance issue is minor and unlikely to cause immediate problems, and address it later if it becomes an issue. Option D. Inform the client about the minor compliance issue, explain the potential implications, and work collaboratively with them to rectify it before finalizing the onboarding process. The correct answer is C. Proceed with onboarding the client immediately, as the compliance issue is minor and unlikely to cause immediate problems, and address it later if it becomes an issue. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a desire to secure a valuable client relationship and the obligation to maintain professional integrity and adhere to regulatory guidelines. The pressure to overlook a minor compliance issue for a significant business opportunity requires careful judgment to ensure that short-term gains do not compromise long-term ethical standing and legal compliance. The correct approach involves promptly and transparently addressing the identified compliance gap with the client, even if it is minor. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical business practices and regulatory adherence, which are foundational to trust and long-term partnerships. By proactively communicating the issue and proposing a solution, Seino Holdings upholds its professional responsibilities and reinforces its reputation as a reliable and compliant entity. This aligns with the principles of integrity and due diligence expected of financial services professionals. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the compliance issue, hoping it goes unnoticed. This carries significant regulatory risk, as even minor breaches can lead to penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client trust if discovered. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the client engagement without full disclosure and resolution of the compliance gap. This constitutes a failure of due diligence and potentially a breach of regulatory requirements concerning client onboarding and ongoing compliance. It prioritizes immediate business interests over established ethical and legal obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the ethical and regulatory implications of the situation. 2. Consulting relevant internal policies and external regulations. 3. Communicating transparently with all relevant parties, including the client and internal compliance departments. 4. Seeking to resolve any identified issues in a manner that upholds integrity and compliance. Question 9. What factors determine the most appropriate method for Seino Holdings to optimize its internal hiring assessment processes while strictly adhering to the guidelines stipulated within the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test framework? Option A. The perceived industry best practices for process optimization, without a primary focus on the unique regulatory and ethical stipulations of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test. Option B. The potential for proposed process changes to significantly reduce operational costs, regardless of their alignment with the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test specific guidelines. Option C. The speed at which proposed process changes can be implemented, with minimal disruption to current operations, even if a comprehensive review against the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test is deferred. Option D. The extent to which proposed process changes demonstrably enhance operational efficiency and align with the explicit compliance requirements and ethical standards outlined in the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test. The correct answer is D. The extent to which proposed process changes demonstrably enhance operational efficiency and align with the explicit compliance requirements and ethical standards outlined in the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Seino Holdings employees tasked with optimizing internal processes. The challenge lies in balancing the pursuit of efficiency gains with the imperative to adhere strictly to the Seino Holdings hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, which emphasizes ethical conduct and compliance. A deep understanding of the specific guidelines within this framework is crucial to avoid actions that, while seemingly efficient, could inadvertently lead to regulatory breaches or ethical compromises. The correct approach involves a thorough review and understanding of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests specific guidelines on process optimization. This means identifying and implementing changes that enhance operational efficiency without violating any stated rules, ethical principles, or compliance requirements outlined in the assessment's documentation. The regulatory justification for this approach is rooted in the fundamental principle of compliance ensuring all actions taken by Seino Holdings personnel align with the established standards and expectations of the hiring assessment. Ethically, it upholds integrity and responsible business practices. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without considering the assessment's guidelines would fail to meet the regulatory requirements. This could lead to the implementation of processes that, for example, inadvertently compromise data privacy or create unfair advantages, both of which would be in direct violation of the spirit and letter of the assessment's rules. Another incorrect approach, prioritizing speed of implementation over thoroughness and compliance checks, risks overlooking critical regulatory nuances. This could result in processes that are superficially efficient but fundamentally non-compliant, leading to potential penalties or reputational damage for Seino Holdings. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests specific directives on process optimization. This involves a risk-based assessment, where potential process changes are evaluated against the established regulatory and ethical standards. Prioritizing compliance and ethical considerations alongside efficiency is paramount. When in doubt, seeking clarification from relevant internal or assessment authorities is a critical step in ensuring that all optimization efforts are both effective and compliant. Question 10. Governance review demonstrates that Seino Holdings is considering a significant international expansion that may involve new product lines and operational structures. While the internal legal team believes the proposed expansion aligns with current general regulatory principles, there is uncertainty regarding specific interpretations of certain cross-border financial regulations that could impact Seino Holdings' reporting obligations. What is the most prudent course of action for Seino Holdings to ensure compliance and mitigate potential risks? Option A. Immediately halt all expansion plans until a comprehensive, in-depth review of all potential regulatory implications across all relevant jurisdictions is completed, even if it significantly delays strategic objectives. Option B. Proactively engage with the relevant regulatory bodies in the target jurisdictions to seek clarification on the specific financial regulations and potentially obtain pre-approval or guidance on the proposed expansion structure. Option C. Rely solely on the advice of external consultants specializing in international business law to navigate the regulatory landscape without direct communication with the regulatory authorities. Option D. Proceed with the expansion based on the internal legal team's assessment, assuming current interpretations are sufficient, and address any potential issues if they arise post-implementation. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the expansion based on the internal legal team's assessment, assuming current interpretations are sufficient, and address any potential issues if they arise post-implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's strategic growth objectives and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. Seino Holdings, like any publicly listed entity, must navigate this tension by prioritizing compliance and ethical conduct, even when it might appear to impede short-term gains. The professional challenge lies in balancing stakeholder interests: shareholders seeking returns, regulators demanding adherence to rules, and the public expecting responsible corporate behavior, while ensuring the long-term sustainability and reputation of Seino Holdings. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with the relevant regulatory bodies to seek clarification and guidance on the proposed expansion strategy. This demonstrates a commitment to transparency, due diligence, and adherence to the spirit and letter of the law. By seeking official interpretation and potentially pre-approval, Seino Holdings mitigates the risk of future noncompliance, which could lead to significant penalties, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. This proactive stance aligns with the fundamental principles of good governance and regulatory compliance, ensuring that Seino Holdings operates within the established legal framework. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the expansion without seeking regulatory clarity, assuming the current interpretation of existing regulations is sufficient. This carries a high risk of misinterpretation or overlooking specific nuances that could render the expansion non-compliant. Such an approach disregards the principle of ignorance of the law as no excuse and could be seen as a deliberate attempt to circumvent regulatory oversight, leading to severe consequences. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on internal legal counsel's opinion without independent verification or direct engagement with the regulators. While internal counsel is valuable, regulatory bodies are the ultimate arbiters of compliance. Over-reliance on internal advice without external validation can lead to blind spots and an incomplete understanding of regulatory expectations, potentially exposing Seino Holdings to significant legal and financial repercussions. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to delay the expansion indefinitely due to perceived regulatory hurdles without actively seeking solutions or engaging in dialogue. A caution is warranted. An inability to adapt and find compliant pathways for growth can signal a lack of strategic foresight and an unwillingness to operate within the established regulatory environment, potentially hindering Seino Holdings' long-term viability. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment, a clear understanding of the relevant regulatory landscape, and a commitment to proactive engagement with regulatory authorities. It requires a balanced perspective that prioritizes compliance and ethical conduct as foundational elements of sustainable business operations, rather than as obstacles to growth. Question 11. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of activity by a Seino Holdings employee that appears to deviate from standard operating procedures. What is the most appropriate initial course of action? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the employee's recent activities, cross-referencing with relevant Seino Holdings policies and procedures, and consult with the employee's direct supervisor before taking any further steps. Option B. Ignore the system's alert as it may be a false positive and not indicative of actual misconduct. Option C. Immediately report the employee for disciplinary action based on the system's alert. Option D. Confront the employee directly and demand an explanation for their actions based solely on the system's output. The correct answer is C. Immediately report the employee for disciplinary action based on the system's alert. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Seino Holdings to interpret and act upon information from a monitoring system that suggests potential noncompliance. The challenge lies in balancing the need for immediate action with the requirement for thorough investigation and adherence to established procedures, all within the specific regulatory framework governing Seino Holdings operations. Misinterpreting the data or acting prematurely could lead to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, or unfair treatment of employees. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between a genuine breach and a system anomaly or a misunderstanding of policy. The correct approach involves a structured, evidence-based investigation that prioritizes gathering all relevant facts before making a determination or taking action. This aligns with principles of due process and regulatory compliance, ensuring that any conclusions are well-founded and defensible. Specifically, it requires consulting internal policies and procedures, seeking clarification from relevant departments or individuals, and documenting all steps taken. This methodical process is crucial for maintaining the integrity of Seino Holdings operations and demonstrating a commitment to regulatory adherence. As mandated by the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests, implied regulatory environment, which emphasizes diligence and procedural correctness. An incorrect approach that immediately escalates the situation without further investigation fails to uphold the principle of fairness and can lead to unwarranted disciplinary action or disruption. This bypasses the necessary steps to confirm the validity of the monitoring system's output, potentially violating internal grievance procedures or employee rights. Another incorrect approach, which involves ignoring the monitoring system's alert altogether, demonstrates a dereliction of duty and a failure to proactively manage compliance risks. This could expose Seino Holdings to significant regulatory scrutiny and penalties for negligence. A third incorrect approach, which involves making a judgment based solely on the system's output without seeking corroborating evidence or understanding the context, is a form of confirmation bias and undermines the objective assessment required by professional standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with acknowledging the information presented by the monitoring system. This should be followed by a phase of information gathering and verification, where internal policies, relevant documentation, and potentially affected parties are consulted. The next step involves analysis of the verified information to determine if a breach has occurred and to what extent. Finally, based on this analysis, a decision is made regarding the appropriate course of action, which could range from further investigation to corrective measures or closing the matter if no breach is found. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, ethical, and compliant with the Seino Holdings hiring assessment tests expected standards of conduct. Question 12. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of Seino Holdings' client base is interested in a new investment product that your immediate supervisor, who is also a close personal friend, has personally invested in prior to its wider release. You have been tasked with advising clients on this product. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for you to take as an employee of Seino Holdings? Option A. Inform your supervisor of your concerns and ask them to assign another colleague to advise clients on this product without involving the compliance department. Option B. Immediately disclose the potential conflict of interest to your compliance department and senior management and await their guidance on how to proceed with advising clients, potentially including recusal from advising specific clients if deemed necessary. Option C. Advise clients on the product but subtly steer them away from it due to the perceived conflict of interest, without explicitly stating the reason. Option D. Proceed with advising clients on the new investment product, highlighting its potential benefits as identified in the product literature, without mentioning your supervisor's personal investment. The correct answer is D. Proceed with advising clients on the new investment product, highlighting its potential benefits as identified in the product literature, without mentioning your supervisor's personal investment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, as a financial services firm, operates under strict regulatory oversight. The decision regarding how to respond to a potential conflict of interest requires careful judgment to ensure compliance with both legal obligations and ethical standards. Mismanagement of such a situation could lead to reputational damage, regulatory sanctions, and loss of client trust. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent disclosure of the potential conflict of interest to all relevant parties, including clients and senior management, and seeking guidance on how to proceed. This aligns with the principles of integrity and client best interest, which are fundamental in financial services. Specifically, regulatory frameworks often mandate disclosure of conflicts to allow clients to make informed decisions and to ensure that the firm acts in their best interest. This approach upholds the duty of care and loyalty owed to clients. An incorrect approach would be to ignore or downplay the potential conflict. This failure to disclose violates regulatory requirements that demand transparency and could be construed as a breach of fiduciary duty. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with the transaction without proper internal review or client consent, which could lead to accusations of self-dealing or acting against client interests, thereby violating ethical codes and potentially specific regulations concerning conflicts of interest. A third incorrect approach might be to disclose the conflict only to internal stakeholders without informing the affected clients, which fails to provide clients with the necessary information to assess the situation and make informed choices, thus undermining client autonomy and trust. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves identifying potential conflicts early, assessing their materiality, disclosing them transparently to all affected parties, and seeking appropriate guidance or approval before proceeding. The framework should emphasize the client's best interest and adherence to the firm's internal policies and external regulations. Question 13. The control framework reveals that Seino Holdings' internal audit department has identified significant control weaknesses in the logistics division's inventory management system. During the exit meeting, the logistics division manager expressed concerns that the audit findings, if reported as is, could negatively impact their performance review and create operational friction. The internal audit manager is considering how to best present these findings to senior management and the audit committee. Which of the following approaches best upholds the principles of professional auditing and corporate governance for Seino Holdings? Option A. The internal audit team modifies the audit report to use less direct language and omits specific examples of control failures to mitigate the perceived negative impact on the logistics division's management. Option B. The internal audit team delays the final reporting of the significant control weaknesses, suggesting they will revisit the findings after the logistics division has had more time to implement proposed operational improvements. Option C. The internal audit team presents the audit findings objectively and factually to senior management and the audit committee, including all identified control weaknesses and their potential implications, while also noting any proposed remediation plans from the logistics division. Option D. The internal audit team discusses the findings informally with the logistics division manager and agrees to a revised set of findings that focuses solely on areas where immediate improvements are already underway, deferring other issues. Correct answer is A. The internal audit team modifies the audit report to use less direct language and omits specific examples of control failures to mitigate the perceived negative impact on the logistics division's management. Explanation. The control framework reveals a potential conflict of interest within Seino Holdings, specifically concerning the interaction between the internal audit department and the operational management of the logistics division. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an auditor to navigate the delicate balance between maintaining independence and objectivity, as mandated by professional standards, and the practical realities of working within an organization. The pressure to maintain positive working relationships or to avoid disrupting ongoing operations can create a temptation to overlook or downplay findings. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the audit process remains robust and that any identified control weaknesses are reported accurately and without undue influence. The correct approach involves the internal audit team meticulously documenting all findings, regardless of their perceived impact on operational relationships, and presenting them objectively to the relevant management levels, including the audit committee. This approach upholds the fundamental principles of professional auditing, such as integrity, objectivity, and due professional care, as outlined in relevant professional standards, e.g., the Institute of Internal Auditors International Professional Practices Framework. By adhering to established audit procedures and reporting lines, the internal audit team ensures that Seino Holdings' governance structure is effectively utilized to address control deficiencies. This also aligns with the expectation that internal audit acts as an independent assurance function. An incorrect approach would be to modify the audit report to soften the language or omit certain findings to appease the logistics division management. This action constitutes a failure of objectivity and integrity, potentially misleading senior management and the audit committee about the true state of internal controls. It also violates the professional duty to report truthfully and accurately. Another incorrect approach would be to delay the reporting of significant control weaknesses indefinitely, citing ongoing operational improvements. This failure to report in a timely manner undermines the purpose of internal audit, which is to provide timely assurance and facilitate corrective action. It also breaches the professional obligation to act with due professional care and to ensure that stakeholders are informed of material risks. Professionals in similar situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Clearly identifying the potential control weakness and its implications. 2. Consulting relevant professional standards and internal policies to understand the required course of action. 3. Documenting all evidence and findings meticulously. 4. Communicating findings through established reporting channels, ensuring that all relevant parties, including senior management and the audit committee, are informed. And 5. Being prepared to defend the audit findings based on objective evidence and professional judgment, while remaining open to constructive dialogue regarding remediation plans. Question 14. The control framework reveals that a senior associate at Seino Holdings has been approached by a key client who is seeking an early indication of Seino Holdings' upcoming strategic partnership announcement, which is not yet public. The client believes this information could significantly impact their investment portfolio. What is the most appropriate course of action for the senior associate to take, adhering strictly to the regulatory framework and Seino Holdings' internal guidelines? Option A. Explain that while the announcement is pending, the client should consider their existing holdings in light of general market trends. Option B. Inform the client that the information is confidential and cannot be disclosed, and advise them to await the official public announcement. Option C. Share a general overview of the partnership's potential benefits with the client, assuring them it will be positive. Option D. Suggest the client make an immediate investment based on the anticipated positive impact of the announcement. The correct answer is B. Inform the client that the information is confidential and cannot be disclosed, and advise them to await the official public announcement. Explanation. The control framework reveals a potential conflict of interest within Seino Holdings concerning the disclosure of non-public information. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the delicate balance between business relationships and regulatory compliance, where a misstep could lead to significant legal and reputational damage for Seino Holdings. The pressure to maintain good client relations might tempt an individual to share information that could be perceived as advantageous, but doing so without proper authorization or consideration of insider trading regulations would be a severe breach. The correct approach involves a strict adherence to Seino Holdings' internal policies on information handling and disclosure, coupled with a thorough understanding of relevant securities laws. This means recognizing that any information not publicly disseminated, especially if it could influence investment decisions, is considered non-public. The professional obligation is to refrain from sharing such information with external parties, including clients, unless explicitly permitted by policy and law. This aligns with the ethical duty of confidentiality and the regulatory imperative to prevent market abuse and insider trading. Specifically, under the framework governing financial markets, the unauthorized disclosure of material non-public information is a serious offense. An incorrect approach would be to assume that sharing information with a long-standing client is acceptable due to the existing relationship. This fails to acknowledge that the nature of the information, not the relationship with the recipient, dictates its sensitivity and the legal restrictions on its dissemination. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on a vague understanding of confidentiality, without consulting Seino Holdings' specific policies or seeking guidance from the compliance department. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to understand the precise boundaries of permissible information sharing. A third incorrect approach would be to rationalize the disclosure by believing the information is not that important or that the client won't act on it. This subjective judgment bypasses established regulatory safeguards designed to protect market integrity and prevent even the appearance of impropriety. Professionals in such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying the nature of the information. Is it public or non-public? Is it material? 2. Consulting Seino Holdings' internal policies and procedures regarding information disclosure and confidentiality. 3. If there is any doubt, seeking clarification from the compliance or legal department. 4. Acting with prudence and erring on the side of caution, even if it means declining a request that seems benign. Question 15. The performance metrics show a significant increase in revenue for Seino Holdings in the last fiscal quarter, driven by a new product launch. However, these metrics also indicate a concurrent rise in operational costs and a slight decrease in customer satisfaction scores compared to the previous year. Considering the regulatory framework for public companies, which approach to communicating these performance metrics to stakeholders is most appropriate for Seino Holdings? Option A. Emphasize the rise in operational costs as a sign of aggressive investment in infrastructure, downplaying the revenue figures and customer satisfaction as secondary indicators. Option B. Highlight the revenue growth prominently in all communications, while briefly mentioning the increased costs as a necessary investment for future expansion and omitting the customer satisfaction data. Option C. Focus exclusively on the revenue growth, framing it as a testament to Seino Holdings' innovative capabilities and market leadership, without any mention of costs or customer feedback. Option D. Present a balanced overview of performance, detailing the revenue increase, explaining the drivers of increased operational costs, and addressing the dip in customer satisfaction with a plan for improvement. The correct answer is B. Highlight the revenue growth prominently in all communications, while briefly mentioning the increased costs as a necessary investment for future expansion and omitting the customer satisfaction data. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, as a regulated entity, must ensure its performance metrics are not only accurate, but also presented in a manner that complies with all relevant disclosure requirements. Misrepresenting or selectively highlighting metrics can lead to regulatory scrutiny, investor distrust, and potential legal ramifications. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need to showcase positive performance with the obligation for transparency and fairness in reporting. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all relevant performance indicators, both positive and negative, and presenting them in a balanced and contextualized manner. This aligns with the principles of fair disclosure and market integrity, which are paramount in regulated financial environments. Specifically, it adheres to guidelines that mandate the disclosure of material information, ensuring that stakeholders have a complete picture to make informed decisions. This approach prioritizes accuracy, completeness, and transparency, thereby upholding regulatory compliance and ethical standards. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on positive metrics, while omitting or downplaying negative ones, fails to meet the standards of fair presentation. This selective reporting can mislead stakeholders about the true financial health and operational performance of Seino Holdings, potentially violating regulations that prohibit misleading statements or omissions of material facts. Another incorrect approach that uses overly optimistic or speculative language to describe performance, even if based on some positive data, can also be problematic. Such language can create unrealistic expectations and may be considered promotional rather than informative, contravening rules against misleading advertising or communications. Finally, an approach that prioritizes short-term gains or superficial appearances over substantive, long-term performance indicators risks misrepresenting the underlying stability and future prospects of the company, which is a breach of responsible corporate governance and regulatory expectations. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of all applicable regulatory disclosure requirements. This involves identifying all material performance metrics, both favorable and unfavorable. The next step is to contextualize these metrics, providing explanations for any significant deviations or trends. The focus should always be on factual accuracy, completeness, and clarity, ensuring that the information presented is not misleading. Finally, it is crucial to have internal review processes in place to vet all public disclosures for compliance and ethical soundness before dissemination. Question 16. The control framework reveals a potential discrepancy in the data handling procedures at Seino Holdings, where an employee observes that certain client financial records appear to be accessed and processed by an unauthorized third-party vendor without explicit client consent or documented internal approval. Considering Seino Holdings' commitment to regulatory compliance and client data protection, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the employee? Option A. Ignore the discrepancy, assuming it is a minor oversight or not within one's direct responsibility. Option B. Immediately report the observed discrepancy to the designated compliance officer or internal audit department at Seino Holdings. Option C. Attempt to rectify the discrepancy independently by accessing and modifying the client financial records. Option D. Discuss the discrepancy with colleagues who are not part of the designated reporting chain for such matters. The correct answer is B. Immediately report the observed discrepancy to the designated compliance officer or internal audit department at Seino Holdings. Explanation. The control framework reveals a potential conflict of interest within Seino Holdings concerning the handling of sensitive client information. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an employee to navigate competing loyalties, their duty to Seino Holdings, their professional ethical obligations, and potentially legal requirements regarding data privacy. A careful judgment is required to ensure that client confidentiality is maintained, while also adhering to internal company policies and external regulations. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the observed discrepancy to the designated compliance officer or internal audit department at Seino Holdings. This is the best professional practice because it adheres to the principle of transparency and accountability within the organization's established control framework. Specifically, it aligns with the regulatory expectation that any potential breaches or weaknesses in controls, particularly those involving sensitive data, must be reported promptly to the appropriate internal authority for investigation and remediation. This proactive reporting ensures that Seino Holdings can address the issue before it escalates, potentially leading to regulatory penalties or reputational damage. It also demonstrates a commitment to upholding ethical standards and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the discrepancy, assuming it is a minor oversight or not within one's direct responsibility. This failure is professionally unacceptable, as it breaches the duty of care and the implicit obligation to report potential control weaknesses. It could lead to a violation of data protection regulations, such as those governing client confidentiality, and expose Seino holdings to significant legal and financial repercussions. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to rectify the discrepancy independently without proper authorization or understanding of the full implications. This could inadvertently worsen the situation, compromise data integrity, or violate internal procedures for handling sensitive information. It bypasses the established control mechanisms designed to ensure accuracy and security, and could be seen as an unauthorized access or modification of data, leading to disciplinary action and potential legal consequences. A third incorrect approach would be to discuss the discrepancy with colleagues who are not part of the designated reporting chain for such matters. This constitutes a breach of confidentiality and could lead to the unauthorized dissemination of sensitive information, creating further risks for Seino Holdings and its clients. It undermines the integrity of the control framework and the trust placed in employees to handle information responsibly. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of Seino Holdings' internal policies on reporting, whistleblowing, and data handling. Employees should be trained to identify red flags related to control weaknesses and data security. When such issues arise, the immediate step should be to consult the company's compliance manual or seek guidance from a supervisor or the compliance department. The guiding principle should always be to act in a manner that upholds regulatory requirements, ethical standards, and the best interests of the company and its clients. Prioritizing transparent and authorized reporting channels. Question 17. Strategic planning requires Seino Holdings to consider a new market entry that involves complex cross-border transactions. Which of the following approaches best ensures regulatory compliance and ethical conduct during the planning phase? Option A. Disclose only the aspects of the market entry strategy that are perceived as beneficial to investors, while withholding details deemed less favorable or potentially complex from a regulatory standpoint. Option B. Rely on the company's existing internal legal team's general knowledge of international business law without specific consultation on the nuances of the new market's regulatory environment. Option C. Engage external legal and compliance experts to thoroughly review the proposed market entry strategy and its implications for Seino Holdings' disclosure obligations and adherence to all applicable laws. Option D. Proceed with the market entry based on internal assessments of regulatory requirements, prioritizing speed to gain a competitive advantage. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the market entry based on internal assessments of regulatory requirements, prioritizing speed to gain a competitive advantage. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, as a publicly listed entity, operates under strict regulatory oversight. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the company's strategic objectives with its legal and ethical obligations concerning financial reporting and disclosure. Misinterpreting or circumventing these requirements can lead to severe consequences, including regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and loss of investor confidence. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all strategic decisions are underpinned by a robust understanding of the applicable regulatory framework. The correct approach involves proactively seeking expert legal and compliance counsel to review the proposed strategic initiative. This ensures that Seino Holdings' plans align with all relevant laws and regulations before implementation. Specifically, this approach demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance by engaging with qualified professionals who can provide definitive guidance on disclosure obligations, potential conflicts of interest, and any other legal ramifications. This proactive stance is ethically sound and legally prudent, safeguarding the company and its stakeholders. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over compliance by proceeding with the initiative without thorough legal review is professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a disregard for regulatory obligations and an assumption of risk that could expose Seino Holdings to significant penalties. Fails to uphold the ethical duty of care owed to shareholders and the market by potentially engaging in non-compliant activities. Another incorrect approach, which involves selectively disclosing information to stakeholders based on perceived benefit rather than mandated requirements, is also professionally unacceptable. This constitutes a breach of transparency and potentially misleading conduct, violating principles of fair disclosure and market integrity. Such selective disclosure can lead to insider trading allegations or other forms of market manipulation. Finally, An approach that relies solely on internal assumptions about regulatory interpretation without external validation is professionally risky. While internal expertise is valuable, regulatory frameworks are complex and subject to interpretation. Failing to seek external legal and compliance advice leaves Seino Holdings vulnerable to misinterpretations that could have serious legal and financial repercussions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment that explicitly includes regulatory compliance. This framework should mandate consultation with legal and compliance departments or external experts whenever strategic initiatives have potential implications for financial reporting, disclosure, or market conduct. Prioritizing a thorough understanding and adherence to the regulatory framework is paramount, even if it introduces a slight delay to strategic execution. Question 18. The efficiency study reveals that certain operational processes at Seino Holdings, if streamlined as recommended, could lead to a reduction in the time taken to recognize certain revenue streams. This potential change in revenue recognition timing, while improving operational efficiency, might also impact the company's reported financial performance and require adjustments to existing regulatory disclosures. Which of the following is the most appropriate approach for Seino Holdings to take in response to these findings? Option A. Immediately implement the recommended process changes to capitalize on efficiency gains and address any necessary disclosure adjustments retrospectively if issues arise. Option B. Proceed with implementing the efficiency measures and only disclose the changes if specifically asked by regulators, assuming that internal operational improvements do not require proactive external reporting. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the study's implications with the compliance and legal departments to assess potential impacts on financial reporting and regulatory obligations, and proceed with implementation only after ensuring full compliance and appropriate disclosures. Option D. Instruct the efficiency study team to revise their findings to downplay any potential impact on revenue recognition and financial reporting, thereby avoiding any immediate regulatory scrutiny. The correct answer is A. Immediately implement the recommended process changes to capitalize on efficiency gains and address any necessary disclosure adjustments retrospectively if issues arise. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, like any financial institution, operates under strict regulatory oversight designed to protect investors and maintain market integrity. The efficiency study's findings, if not handled appropriately, could lead to misrepresentations or omissions in financial reporting, potentially violating disclosure requirements and fiduciary duties. Careful judgment is required to balance the pursuit of operational efficiency with the imperative of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented review of the efficiency study's implications by the relevant compliance and legal departments, followed by appropriate disclosures if the findings impact financial statements or regulatory filings. This aligns with the principles of transparency and accuracy mandated by financial regulations. Specifically, it upholds the duty to provide a true and fair view of the company's financial position and performance, as required by accounting standards and securities laws. This proactive and transparent method ensures that Seino Holdings meets its obligations to regulators and stakeholders, mitigating the risk of penalties, reputational damage, and legal action. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on implementing the efficiency measures without considering their regulatory impact fails to acknowledge the company's legal and ethical obligations. This could lead to violations of disclosure rules, where material information is not reported or misleading statements are made. Another incorrect approach, which involves suppressing or selectively reporting the study's findings to avoid negative implications, directly contravenes principles of honesty and integrity. This constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and can result in severe regulatory sanctions, including fines and disqualification of management. A third incorrect approach, which involves making assumptions about regulatory requirements without consulting experts, is also professionally unsound. It risks misinterpreting or overlooking critical compliance obligations, leading to unintentional breaches. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the regulatory landscape, assessing potential risks and impacts, consulting with internal and external experts, compliance, legal, auditors, and ensuring all actions are documented and transparent. This systematic approach ensures that business objectives are pursued responsibly and in full compliance with all applicable laws and ethical standards. Question 19. The efficiency study reveals that implementing a new automated client onboarding system at Seino Holdings could significantly reduce processing times and operational costs. However, the study did not explicitly detail the system's compliance with data privacy regulations or its audit trail capabilities. Which of the following approaches best addresses the potential risks associated with this efficiency improvement? Option A. Proceed with the implementation of the new system immediately to capitalize on cost savings, assuming standard compliance measures are in place. Option B. Delay the implementation indefinitely due to the lack of explicit compliance details in the efficiency study. Option C. Conduct a thorough risk assessment to identify and evaluate potential compliance, operational, and data security risks before proceeding with any implementation. Option D. Rely on the vendor's assurances that the system is compliant and implement it with minimal internal review. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the implementation of the new system immediately to capitalize on cost savings, assuming standard compliance measures are in place. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, as a financial services firm, operates within a highly regulated environment. The efficiency study's findings, while potentially beneficial for operational improvements, must be evaluated through the lens of compliance and risk management. A hasty implementation without proper due diligence could expose the company to significant regulatory breaches, reputational damage, and financial penalties. Therefore, a careful and systematic approach to risk assessment is paramount. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that identifies, analyzes, and evaluates potential risks associated with the proposed efficiency improvements. This includes considering the impact on data security, client confidentiality, regulatory reporting accuracy, and the overall integrity of Seino Holdings operations. By proactively identifying and mitigating these risks, the company can ensure that efficiency gains do not compromise its adherence to regulatory frameworks and ethical standards. This aligns with the principles of sound risk management expected of financial institutions, emphasizing a proactive and preventative stance. An incorrect approach would be to prioritize immediate cost savings without a thorough risk evaluation. This could lead to the adoption of new technologies or processes that, while seemingly efficient, may not meet regulatory requirements for data handling or audit trails. Another incorrect approach would be to implement changes based solely on anecdotal evidence or the recommendations of external vendors, without independent verification of their compliance implications. Such actions would disregard the fundamental duty of care owed to clients and the regulatory obligations of Seino Holdings, potentially resulting in breaches of data protection laws, anti-money laundering regulations, or other relevant financial conduct rules. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the regulatory landscape applicable to Seino Holdings. This involves identifying all relevant laws, regulations, and industry guidelines. Next, they should systematically assess the potential risks and benefits of any proposed change, considering both operational and compliance perspectives. This assessment should involve cross-functional teams, including legal, compliance, and operational departments. Finally, decisions should be made based on a balanced consideration of efficiency gains, risk mitigation, and regulatory adherence, ensuring that any implemented changes are sustainable and compliant. Question 20. The efficiency study reveals potential cost savings for Seino Holdings through streamlining certain client onboarding processes. Which of the following approaches best addresses the associated risks and ensures regulatory compliance? Option A. Conduct a thorough risk assessment to identify potential compliance, operational, and reputational risks associated with the proposed streamlining, and develop mitigation strategies before implementation. Option B. Immediately implement the proposed streamlining to realize cost savings quickly, assuming that efficiency gains inherently reduce risk. Option C. Focus solely on the cost-saving aspects of the study, prioritizing rapid implementation to maximize financial benefits for Seino Holdings. Option D. Delegate the implementation of the streamlining to the operational team with minimal oversight, trusting their judgment to manage any emergent issues. Correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough risk assessment to identify potential compliance, operational, and reputational risks associated with the proposed streamlining, and develop mitigation strategies before implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Seino Holdings, as a financial institution, operates under strict regulatory scrutiny. The efficiency study's findings, if not handled appropriately, could lead to misinterpretations or actions that violate regulatory principles concerning risk management and client disclosures. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the pursuit of operational efficiency with the imperative to maintain robust risk controls and adhere to all applicable laws and guidelines. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any proposed changes are not only efficient, but also compliant and ethically sound, protecting both the company and its stakeholders. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that systematically identifies, analyzes, and evaluates potential risks associated with the efficiency study's recommendations. This approach is best professional practice because it aligns with the fundamental principles of sound risk management mandated by regulatory frameworks. Specifically, it ensures that Seino Holdings proactively addresses potential negative impacts on compliance, client service, and operational integrity before implementing changes. This proactive stance is crucial for demonstrating due diligence and adherence to regulatory expectations for risk mitigation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without considering the associated risks would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for regulatory requirements that emphasize comprehensive risk management, not just cost saving. Implementing changes based purely on cost cutting could inadvertently lead to breaches of client confidentiality, inadequate fraud prevention, or operational failures, all of which carry significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of implementation over thoroughness would also be professionally unsound. Regulatory bodies expect financial institutions to conduct due diligence and implement changes in a controlled and measured manner. Rushing the process increases the likelihood of overlooking critical risks, leading to noncompliance with data protection laws, anti-money laundering regulations, or other operational standards. Such haste demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and a failure to uphold the integrity of the institution's operations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk management framework. This framework typically includes identifying all potential risks, operational, compliance, reputational, strategic, assessing the likelihood and impact of each risk, developing mitigation strategies, and establishing ongoing monitoring and review mechanisms. Professionals must always consider the regulatory landscape and ethical implications of any proposed action, ensuring that decisions are not only commercially beneficial, but also compliant and responsible.